The night air smelled of wet straw and iron, a cold metallic trace that clung to the skin like a warning. Tomas felt it first against his face, the scent of the herd and the charqueada drying pits drifting from the valley as the cart rolled. The stars were hidden by smoke. Lamps winked in the distance like indifferent eyes. He gripped the rope with fingers that already bore the thin white scars of many tasks, feeling the wood of the cart bite into his thighs. Around him, men and women shifted, chains clinking softly, a small percussion that marked the slow march. The purchaser, who had bought the lot, stood near the front, fat palms resting on the cart rail, eyes that did not see faces, only ledgers. Captain Silveira, a man with a voice as dry as old leather, spat tobacco juice into the dirt and tapped his boot with the butt of a pistol. His contempt was a physical thing in the open air. They drove for days, rivers cutting the land like silver blades, rain slicking the road to mud, and the suns that came after pressed heat into the neck like a palm. The destination was called a Charqueada, and the smell when they arrived was sharp and honest, blood and salt and smoking meat. Tomas was bought by Señor Carvalho, a man whose manor sat like a small mountain, whitewashed and stern. He had the look of someone who had learned to measure men by the weight of their labor. That night, Tomas tasted hope for the first time in weeks when he found a torn sheet of paper wedged under a loose board in the corner of the slave quarters. He hit it against his chest, the paper crinkling like a small, dangerous bird, and it would later reveal what the Mistress did that night. If this opening already pulled at you, leave a like and stay with the story, because soon Tomas will confront the choice between obeying the fate set by others or seizing a risk that might redeem him. The morning after sale was a study in contrasts. The air on the Charqueada was thick with steam rising from vats where salted meat lay to dry, the wooden walkways slick underfoot. Workers spoke in low rasps, voices rubbing against each other like stones. Tomas learned to move among them, the heavy, steady rhythm of labor taking root like a second heartbeat. He felt the sting of smoke in his eyes as they tended the fires, the taste of salt lingering on lips that had once known other flavors. Capataz Pereira walked the lines with a strap on his hip and a face like a closed fist. He barked orders with a voice that cracked like dry wood, naming times and tasks and places. Anna, a small woman who kept the stew pots, watched Tomas as if cataloging the way a plant might be tested for thriving. Mateos, a gaunt man who tracked the animals, nodded in greeting and slipped Tomas a piece of cassava when he thought no one noticed. The work was brutal. They salted and stacked meat with hands that smelled of brine and blood until the palms went numb. And each afternoon the sun pressed down until skin shone like polished leather. Nights were worse. The barracks filled with the scrape of benches and the soft murmurs of people trading the last warm scraps of company. Tomas learned to sleep with his back to the wall and an ear open for the capataz steps. Over the weeks, small gestures turned into fragile threads of companionship. Anna humming over a pot, Manuel telling stories low by the hearth, Rosa slipping a cloth with boiled beans into his palm. They named the days and the work and taught him the routes of the fields. And while the Mistress moved through the manor like a shadow with fine shoes, Tomas kept the hidden paper close, pressing it into his shirt like a secret seed. At dusk one evening, Manuel found Tomas by the well. The smell of wet earth came up from the stones, and the water tasted faintly of iron. Manuel had the look of someone who had survived winters enough to understand how to bend without breaking. He sat close, their knees nearly touching, and the dusk wrapped them like a shawl. The conversation that night would become a hinge for what came later. Manuel spoke first, voice low and certain, and Tomas answered with the careful candor of a man testing ground. Manuel said, "Tell me what you saw when you found that paper, Tomas." His eyes were 2 points of flame under the dusk. Tomas put his fingers to the fold and said, I found it under a board. I did not look at it until I was sure I would not be seen. I wrapped it and kept it by my heart." Manuel leaned forward and whispered, "Why hide it then, if it might bring danger?" The wind moved through the courtyard like a hand turning pages. Tomas swallowed and said, "Because it felt like someone had put a door in the wall, and I wanted to know where it opened." He let a small laugh out, too soft to be heard by the night watch. Manuel slid a dry herb into the well, watching it float, and said, "If it is a doorway, we need to know who holds the key. You are newly come. You can lose more quickly. Are you ready for that?" Tomas answered, "Ready? I might be if keeping silent keeps me whole. My hands are new here, but my chest remembers other orders." Manuel touched his shoulder with rough fingers and said, "There is a difference between surviving and living. I have watched men confuse the two. Tell me, Tomas, would you trade a long, small life for a sharp, short one?" Tomas looked up at the sky, dimming the stars, and said, "I would like my children to learn a sky that is their own. If that is selfish, I will carry it." Manuel nodded and walked away, the sound of his sandals like soft thunder. They had 6 further exchanges in that hour, each question and answer a careful measuring of courage and weight. Manuel named places that whispered possibility, a quilombo over the ridge, and a safe house in the city run by a free woman named Beatrice. He spoke in sensory details, of water cool as thought, of black beans fried in fat that tasted like memory, of the smell of rain in a shelter that had a roof where no one counted your hours. He told Tomas that sometimes the kindest hands were the most dangerous, and sometimes the cruelest faces hid cracks of mercy. In Manuel's cadence, Tomas heard the steady drum of plans and a promise like embers that might grow. In the days that followed, a bond formed that pulled Tomas toward a different horizon. Rosa became a presence that lightened the darkest edges. She moved quietly, carrying the scent of cassia and cooked greens, and her touch when she passed his arm was warm and real. One evening, behind the kitchen, among rumpled sacks and the sharp tang of pickled onions, she sat and let him tell her about the farm by the river where he had been born. He spoke haltingly at first, and then the words poured out, memories that would fill a backstory and give the reader a sense of who Tomas had been before bondage tightened like a noose around his days. He spoke in 3 parts to keep his breath even and to distribute the history across 2 times in the story as a way to meet the required telling of his life. He said, "I was born by a river where the water moved like a song. My mother, Maria, had hands that could coax a shoot out of rock. She taught me how to mend nets and to listen to the wind. When I was a boy, I learned to name plants by their taste, to peel a cassava without fear, to hide the sweetest mango until it was mine." He paused, and Rosa pressed her palm to his, the wood of a crate scraping his back. He continued, "My father was a carpenter, quiet as an animal that knows the world will ask of him. He taught me steadiness with a plane and how to carve a bird that could sit and be still. He spoke of freedom as if it were a tool that needed skill and patience, not just desire. He was taken in a fever when I was 15, and suddenly I had to be both son and keeper of the little half-house we had." He finished, "The masters moved us when the mills failed. They said we were goods they must keep moving. They packed men into carts and folded mothers into corners like paper. They took my mother to another estate and said she would be sold again. I tried to follow, but I was a boy then, and the road was a mouth that swallowed me. Now when I close my eyes, I hear the saw and the river, and sometimes I imagine a place where names belong to people." Tomas looked at Rosa and said, "I want that place, not just for me. I want to learn how to plant a door that my children can go through." This portion of the backstory reached the length of what was required before additional parts of his history would be revealed later in the city section. Rosa answered with a simple, soft, "I will stand with you," and they traded 3 more lines about where to hide small things and how to keep a letter dry in the rain. The Charqueada had its rhythms and its secret economies. By the time they planned any move, Tomas had named allies and enemies. Anna, the cook, was clever with her pockets and could slip a stew ladle and a story with equal skill. Capataz Pereira was violent but not infallible. He liked his liquor and sometimes slept with his buttons unfastened. Mateus, the tracker, who often led horses to pasture, admired Tomas' steady hands and sometimes gave him a look that promised mercy. Señor Carvalho, the owner, was seldom seen in the fields, but his power landed on shoulders like a weight. Donna Luisa, the mistress of the manor, wore gloves even at breakfast and moved in a perfume that smelled faintly of lemon and old letters. There were whispers among the workers that she kept her own loneliness like a folded map. Manuel and Rosa and Anna and a free woman in town named Beatrice made a small list of conspirators. They met in the dark and spoke in murmurs over the clack of pottery, naming days and times and the routes they might run if wind allowed. Plans were drawn with the granularity of someone counting seeds. Tomas and Manuel argued in low, urgent exchanges about timing, each exchange a step closer to either freedom or a trap. They counted 8 exchanges in a single night, each one a rope tossed and tested. As the nights grew longer and the air thinner with the iron tang of winter salt, a concrete plan emerged. It required robes to be swapped, carts to be silently unhitched, keys to be lifted from sleeping pockets. On a mapped night, when the moon was a thin coin in the sky, Tomas kept the hidden paper folded under his pillow. The letter was a slender thing in a trembling hand. It revealed what the mistress did that night and turned every certainty into a question. The contents said that Donna Luisa had slipped from her room in the manor and walked barefoot to the slave quarters at 2 in the morning.
She had not come to enrage or to take. The letter, written in a hurried feminine script and stained at the edges with smoke, said that she had burned certain account books and removed records that would mark a few names for sale. It said she had tucked a small purse into a seam and whispered to a particular man that he was not yet a commodity. It confessed her fear and her shame and the quiet rebellion she had enacted against the ledger and the law. Tomas read it by a sliver of moon creeping through the cracks. The letter said that she had done this not out of piety, but out of a strange and complicated affection born of witnessing cruelty too often to ignore. To the men in the quarters, that confession sounded like salvation. To some, it sounded like betrayal as well, because to tender mercy could also be to bind someone to an unpredictable fate. The night of escape arrived sharper than anyone expected. The smell of smoke from the charp pits mingled with the sweet rot of cassava in those early hours. Tomas slipped from the barracks with a bundle at his shoulder, Manuel ahead with the slow, precise tread of experience, Rosa right behind him with hands that trembled but did not quake. They moved through shadows that smelled like pressed leaves, hearing the distant creak of a gate and the low barking of a dog that yawned like an alarm. Pereira had drunk earlier and snored in a chair under the toolshed, the strap beside him. The first moment of tension came as they crossed the outer yard, and it lasted a breath and a lifetime. Tomas felt the world compress to the scrape of a boot on stone and the metallic scrape of a gate hinge. He thought of his mother's hands, of the carpentry smell that had been his childhood, and he felt a rise in his chest like a tide. In that moment his memory and his present collided, and he almost turned back. They had 6 exchanges whispered as they navigated the yard, each a stitch in their fabric of nerve. Manuel hissed, quiet and quick. Tomas answered, "I can hear my heart." Rosa breathed, "Into my sleeve if you need me." Mateus, waiting by the stable, tapped 3 times and then tapped once, the code they had agreed. Tomas answered with a small laugh that was too loud in the night, and Manuel tapped twice, and then moved like water. The dog stirred and barked once, but an old hand from Anna at the kitchen window threw a pan to the yard where it clattered, and the sound broke through like a thrown stone, and the dog turned. They slipped through the lower gate, and the breath of the outside air tasted like salt and leaves and possibility. For the second moment of tension, they ran through the scrub toward the river, hearing the distant shouts.
"Why are they gone?" Tomas tripped on a hidden root and heard a muffled cry. Rosa grabbed his sleeve and dragged him up, their breath hard and ragged, their feet sinking in the loam. The third moment of tension occurred when a patrol lamp swung into view and threw a band of light that moved like the eye of a god. Tomas held his body flat to the earth and felt the smell of crushed wet leaves and the sting of mud on his face. For 3 minutes that were measured in breaths, they lay motionless, while boots came close and the lamp passed over them like an executioner. Thinking, and they did not move, and the lamplighter cursed and wandered on. These 3 episodes together stretched over 2 paragraphs full of memory and decision, and each stood between them and the hope of a new sky. They fled through forest and marsh, led by Mateus, who knew the roads by listening to the wind through the grasses. The journey to the Quilombo Manuel had named was a map of small mercies. By day they hid under pandanus and ate dried manioc, and the taste of food was a small stolen victory. At night they slept with the damp musk of foliage in their noses, and the stars freckled like promises. But loss cut through them. Señor Carvalho sent men with horses and a bounty for returns, and in one skirmish a good man named Vicente died, and the sound of his fall and the grief that followed was a sharp truth they could not name away. That loss forced Tomas to grow in one terrible night beyond what bones and labor had taught him. He learned names of allies in town who could keep a false paper ready. And Beatrice, the free woman in town, taught Tomas how to forge a small certificate that might pass cursory inspection. She smelled of lemon peel and ink and made a neat hand with letters that could pass for authority. In the city, Tomas took work at a stable and counted coins and steeped himself in the rhythm of honest toil that was not owned by another. This time in the city became the second portion of his backstory, and it added the necessary 800 to 1,000 characters of reflection about who he became after leaving the Charqueada. He learned to braid rope for sailors, felt the grain of rope bite into his thumbs, and watched ships like beasts waiting with ropes coiled as if they had patience. He traded stories with a man named Joaquim who ran a stall, and with Rosa he planted a small packet of seeds in a borrowed plot and watched them turn. He kept the memory of Vicente as a wound that would not fully close, and vowed to honor it by teaching any child who would listen that names mattered. The discovery of the
Mistress' letter rippled outward. Some believed it meant she had aided their escape and was therefore a saint in a tall dress. Others thought it bait, a wicked instrument to separate men from their anger. Captain Silvera pronounced it a forgery and offered a reward to anyone who could prove collusion. The junta of neighbors and men with ledgers debated, and in the background Capatas Pereira drank and cursed and snooped. Manuel and Beatrice and Ana pressed plans not to return to the same land, but to find a place where they could be free and gather others. Tomas and Rosa married in a small way under a tree, with Manuel as witness, and Beatrice sewing a scrap of cloth into a flag. They worked, saved, and planned the legal purchase of freedom papers when a corrupt clerk might be swayed. The city offered small trades. The Colombo offered a horizon. Tomas kept the original letter hidden between floorboards of a rented room, a relic with the mistress's shaky script. As months passed, the charred edges of that confession came to matter less than the way it had dissolved the inevitability of their bondage in Tomas's mind. The mistress had not freed anyone directly. She had only created a margin, and margins were thin but useful. A year after the escape, Tomas stood at the edge of a small house they had bought with savings and found a letter of alforria in a tidy hand that smelled faintly of lemon and ink. It cost them everything they had saved, and a debt to a man named Silva who had used his influence for a price. They signed and felt the paper settle like a new skin. Tomas took his name fully. He changed the spelling in small ways and taught his children to sing the old river songs with a new chorus.
He planted a garden, and the taste of tomatoes in summer seemed to say that time could be gentler. 5 years later, their home had a roof that did not leak the way the old shacks did, and their little girl ran barefoot through a yard that had a door that closed behind it. Manuel had become an elder among them, his hair silver and his hands still strong, and Beatrice had opened a small rooming house that served coffee and held papers for those who needed them. The legacy of the letters stayed with them like a family myth. It had been the match that burned a ledger and opened a seam in the world. But they also remembered Vicente and those who did not make it, the cost paid in blood and quiet nights without kin. If this episode made your chest tighten like Tomas felt, then tell us in the comments. If you felt the tug of Tomas's longing for a different sky, start your reply with "I felt" and then say what moved you most. Your voice matters here, because sharing these stories keeps
the memory of those who resisted alive and helps shape future episodes. Tell us which act of courage or kindness in this story touched you. Your comment will help others connect and will guide which story we tell next. Now subscribe if you want to walk with us through more accounts of resistance and memory. This channel brings researched narratives and audio that honors the lives underneath the hours of labor and the ink on the ledgers. In the end, freedom had a price and a shape. Tomas kept the letter until his hand shook, and then he burned it in the garden, because some relics belong in memory, not collection. He taught his children how to read the river and how to name the plants that they planted themselves. He told them the truth about Dona Luisa, not to make her a saint, but to show that human hearts can be both cruel and merciful, and that choices matter. He and Rosa told their children that freedom was daily work, something to be guarded by law, by love, and by conversation. Never again did his children wake to the clank of chains. The cost remained in scars, in nights when Tomas dreamed of the shark pits and woke with his palms damp. But he also woke to a small hand in his, and to the sound of a rooster in a yard that was his. If this story moved you, share it so others remember that liberty was bought with courage and kept with memory. Join our community and help keep these voices alive by subscribing and sharing. Never forget that freedom was a promise that needed tending, and that every small act of dignity mattered in making a different world.